Welcome to High-Speed Internet in the Heartland, the challenges and opportunities of rural broadband. Let's talk about our panelists. These panelists have experience in both research and implementation in regards to broadband access in rural America. Alex Marre is a regional economist at the Baltimore branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond and a former economist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Um, as Galt said, I'm Alex Marre. I'm with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. I'm based in Baltimore, but our bank's district starts in South Carolina, goes north through Maryland, and west through West Virginia. My coverage area is DC, Maryland, and West Virginia. And we've been getting into broadband within the Federal Reserve more broadly, and also within our bank. Even before the COVID pandemic. I know that the COVID pandemic has really highlighted how important broadband access is. But really, as a bank, we've been focused on it because of its effects on rural economic performance. As a bank, we have a dual mandate from Congress. One is around stability of prices, of course, but the other is around full employment, which is hard to define. But as you even during the times when back in 2018, 2019, when the macro economy was doing fairly well, as we looked across our district, it was clear that the economic benefits from that long expansion we had beginning after the end of the Great Recession, that strong economic recovery we had wasn't evenly distributed across our district, and that's true across the nation as a whole. In fact, the rural and urban economies are diverging when you look at various labor market outcomes. And the one we're really interested in is labor force participation. If you look at the prime age labor force participation rates across the country, you can see the blue line is the larger cities, the red dotted line is the mid-sized cities, and then the rural areas are shown in the dark green line. We can really see that for a couple of decades here, we've been having this divergence in the economic fortunes of rural and urban areas. So as we looked across our district, we knew we've got to understand this better. So starting in 2018, we started doing some listening sessions all throughout our district, talking to people in rural communities, and we started getting into broadband around 2018 when, and 2019 when we did some tours through smaller towns in West Virginia, and really, we talked to people across a variety of issues on the economy, on health issues, on education issues, workforce development. And broadband was the one thread linking all those pieces together. We kept hearing from people in small towns and rural areas that, we have all these issues, but the one thing that would really help us make some progress on it is broadband infrastructure. And so that's why we've been making this focus here on learning more about the broadband situation. So I'm just really pleased to be part of this discussion to learn more about other approaches to broadband infrastructure expansion. If you look at, again, all this focus that's been on the COVID pandemic, it really gets to the short-term benefits of broadband, but the long-term benefits of rural broadband have been there for a long time. Studies show that broadband, especially when adopted, has positive economic effects. So, a lot of studies have found increases in wages and lower unemployment rates in rural places that have broadband, an increased number of businesses and jobs, an increase in population growth and home values. And really, it can be difficult through all these studies to kind of nail things down because broadband and growth are so tightly linked. The data on broadband infrastructure and where it's at is really poor. But if you look at some careful studies that are out there, one of my favorites is from Purdue University looking at the economic effects of broadband expansion in rural Indiana. They found that every dollar spent on broadband infrastructure resulted in $3 to $4 in economic benefits. And so for me, the case is really clear and has been for some time that broadband's a necessary utility for rural communities. And we really need to turn our attention to it. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really just made the case in stark terms. We've heard, especially talking to legislators in our districts that, within our district, that there's really no more need to make the case about rural broadband. People know that there's a need for it. It's just really how to get it done is the big question. Underlying this, just to kind of get the foundational stuff, why don't we have broadband infrastructure in rural areas? And it's really because rural areas are a perfect storm for poor coverage, and they provide a costly business case for providers. You've got these three, major factors going on. One is low population density, which means, not many customers to pay for the expansion. The greatest distance to existing infrastructure, which again makes it more costly. And lower adoption rates. So adoption rates are basically a measure of, once people have access to the infrastructure, at what rate are they, subscribing to that service? And in rural areas, you have lower adoption rates essentially from these factors, lower income, a higher share of the elderly and disabled in rural communities, and lower levels of average educational attainment, which are all related to the degree to which people decide to subscribe to broadband once it's available. So you've got those three major factors, and rural broadband then just becomes a very costly case for many areas of the country. And on top of that, when we're trying to identify the problem, it's very difficult to nail that down. The FCC estimates between 18 and 20 million Americans don't have access to broadband infrastructure. Research group Broadband Now estimates around 40 to 42 million. Underneath all that is really poor coverage maps that we have identifying where the broadband infrastructure actually is. And this is kind of a well-known issue within the broadband conversation, but it's essentially that the FCC uses this approach of looking at census tracts and allowing providers to say, yes, we have this area covered with broadband infrastructure. And that works okay in urban areas, but in rural areas, those census tracts can be, hundreds of square miles. And so you've got these situations where the provider is maybe providing service to just one house, even within that census tract, and calling that whole census tract covered. And so if you look at the FCC numbers in particular, it's pretty much an underestimate of how many people don't have coverage. So we know these are the factors behind poor infrastructure access, and we don't have a really solid understanding of the true scope of the problem, although we can make some educated guesses about it. Now, once we know the underlying factors, how do we get around solving this? And I think it's pretty clear, since the problem is that these remaining areas are too expensive, we're going to need subsidies to help solve this problem. If you look at how much is it going to cost to get those remaining 18 to 20 million that the FCC says don't have coverage, if you try and estimate how much would it cost to get fiber to all those homes, the FCC estimates that at about $80 billion. Now, we started kind of looking at the cost funding issue as a way to simplify what's a very complex problem. Broadband's a complex problem. You've got a multitude of providers, patchwork of existing infrastructure, many different types of subsidies available. But this chart really tries to help summarize what we've seen in terms of the total cost it's going to take to solve the problem and the funding available. Now, that 80 billion, is there any way to get that down? We looked at a number of different proposals around that. One is if you went to using electrical cooperatives to provide that service, and Mike, who's going to speak on this webinar, really brought this to our attention. And we were able to find some studies to get our hands around how much that would shave off of the total cost to fiber to the home for people not currently covered. And we found that could shave between 5 and 10 billion off of that 80 billion. And that's a very conservative estimate, but it really goes to the fact that Mike will speak to later, that cooperatives have advantages when it comes to providing broadband infrastructure. Another approach, which can be a little bit controversial, is using alternative technologies, especially right now, the discussion around fixed wireless and satellite. With this approach, we again looked at a number of different studies, scaled them, tried to look at, what does the research say about how much we could shave off of that 80 billion? We found you could shave between 8 and 15 billion just by using these less expensive alternative options for providing infrastructure. But the key with fixed wireless and satellite is that they're typically lower quality, can be slower, and even though if you look at fixed wireless in particular, it can have lower upfront costs. Over the long run, it can have significant maintenance costs over time. So you kind of have to be careful with that. But again, it's another option in the toolkit. So you got that. If you just use those two approaches, you get 100% of the people unserved, and you could bring that 80 billion down to 55 to 67 billion. Now, how much funding is available to tackle that problem? Now, just focusing on the public funding. Now, again, other sorts of funding can come in play. There can be private sector funding, which I'll get at in a moment. But we try to get our hands around how much subsidy money is there available through major broadband programs directly focused on broadband infrastructure. And so we added up the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund through the FCC, USDA's various programs, and our best guess of how much state funding there is available. And we arrived at an estimate around 29 billion to throw at that 55 to 67 billion dollar problem. If you look at that, I mean, the bulk of that is in the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is around 20 billion. They're having their auction this month. But if you look at how much money is currently on the ground for this problem, if you take kind of a COVID pandemic lens and we need fast solutions, let's look at even though infrastructure is slow, but let's look at how much money is currently out there on the ground working for us. It's less than 9 billion. So you've got this real chasm, I think, between the funding that's available to the problem. So, but then it becomes, how do you get this, once this auction's over with, how do you make best use of this 30 billion that'll be on the ground soon? And this is where we're really spending the bulk of our time trying to learn the different strategies you can use in your community or region to fill in those holes where there currently aren't commercial options for providers already within the broadband space. What can you do? Well, you could use alternative technologies to help, as I said, to help bring those costs down in those areas. You could also use electrical cooperatives to install fiber, as Mike's going to talk about. And with that, you'd hit about, if all electrical cooperatives in the United States provided broadband, you'd hit about 60% of the people who currently don't have it. So that's another big tool in the toolkit. But what do you do when you don't have potential providers in your region? And this is a particular problem we've noticed in West Virginia, where there's Kelly Workman, who's the West Virginia State Broadband Director, calls this the Swiss cheese problem. They've got this existing infrastructure, but holes throughout the state where there's no infrastructure providers available. And there we're following some public-private partnership approaches that can be brought to bear. And essentially, it's an attempt to take some source of funding, be it a bank, be it the state government, be it a foundation, who fronts some of the upfront costs and works in partnership with some public entity. In one case in West Virginia, we're looking at the use of an economic development authority. They partner and together get a project put together that can apply for the federal subsidies and get that money for these areas that so desperately need it for rural broadband. So that's where we are right now. As a bank, we're looking at the options within public-private partnerships. We're trying to see how we can help the electrical cooperative issue move forward, and any other potential solutions we can think of to help bring broadband to rural America. And so with that,
Next, we will be transitioning to our next speaker, John Pender, who is a senior economist in the USDA's Economic Research Services Rural Economy Branch within the Resource and Rural Economics Division, where he measures household and community wealth and well-being and the impacts of programs and policies on the rural economy.
So I'm going to talk a bit about rural broadband trends and federal broadband programs. I'm going to have to try to zoom through this. I think we're behind time here a bit. We know that there's a digital divide, as Alex talked about, and it's been a longstanding policy concern that has been addressed in many various laws and regulations, orders of the FCC, and Alex mentioned the latest FCC initiative, which is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. And Alex also mentioned there's a lot of research that documents the benefits of broadband availability and adoption for economic outcomes in rural areas. So the necessity, and especially in the context of the current pandemic, the need for broadband has never been clearer. So in my presentation, I'm talking a bit about what do we know about the trends in broadband availability and adoption in rural versus urban areas? Where do we stand in terms of the digital divide? What are the federal broadband programs? And what do we know about the impacts of some of the USDA programs? So Alex mentioned this point that broadband availability as defined by and measured by the FCC is based on if at least one household in a census block has a subscription, then everybody in that block is viewed as having availability, or if the provider could provide service without extraordinary commitments of resources. By that definition, almost every household in the urban areas has availability of broadband, whereas and availability has been improving in recent years in rural areas and tribal areas. But still, as of 2018, you have about 22% of rural households and 28% of people in tribal lands that are lacking access to fixed terrestrial broadband availability. And a similar story regarding the availability of mobile broadband. So, hold on a second. So, as Alex mentioned, there's concerns about the problematic nature of the FCC data on availability. Even the FCC acknowledges that its data are problematic and they're trying to address it, but certainly overstates availability in low population density areas. The data are self-reported from service providers and are based on maximum advertised speeds, not the actual performance. And some of the measures of performance that have been done, such as the Microsoft Airband initiative, found much higher percentages of the population lacking ability to use it at the advertised speeds. So maybe close to half of the population in 2019. So there are definitely problems with the data, but the FCC still argues that they're trying to improve the data, but what they have is the best available to track availability over time. So I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty changing my screen here. Maxwell, can you take control back over and run the slides? I'm not able to control the screen right now. Okay, I was just able to change it. I don't know if you can you see okay, hopefully you can see the screen. So the next slide is on adoption. The FCC is defining adoption as a percentage of the households that have availability that are subscribing. And the chart here on the upper right is showing growing adoption rates across rural and urban areas and in tribal areas, but still not everyone is adopting. And as of late 2018, 40% of people in rural areas and 56% in tribal areas had not subscribed. So there are some concerns about the adoption data as well. Looking at alternative source of adoption data, the American Community Survey, you get a adoption by different types of technologies shown in the lower part of that figure. You do see, for example, fixed terrestrial wired broadband. There's some increase in rural areas, but there's still more than 40% of people are not adopting, a higher percentage adopting in urban areas. In fact, there's higher adoption of cellular as well, but satellite is the one technology where there's more adoption in rural areas. So now turning to the broadband programs. So you have on this slide, I'm not showing every program, and in fact, Alex mentioned the new program, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is just starting, but the FCC has 4 programs under its Universal Service Fund, including the High Cost Program and the Rural Healthcare Program, both of which are targeted to rural areas. The Lifeline and E-rate programs are more general. And then USDA has several programs, some of which, like the telecommunications infrastructure loans, they date back to the telephone loan programs in earlier times. Then you have the Rural Broadband Loan Program and Community Connect grants, which started in the early 2000s. The distance learning and telemedicine grants focusing on education and healthcare services. The new the Reconnect program, which was started in 2018, also it's a grant and loan program. And then you have 2 programs that were initiated under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Those were pretty large investments at the time. The Broadband Initiatives Program, which was run by USDA, and the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program run by the NTIA. So the FCC programs have been operated under the Universal Service Fund, which is about $8 to $9 billion a year. The High Cost Program is the largest of those programs, now in 2019 accounting for over 60% of the Universal Service Fund spending or disbursements. That program, the High Cost Program, initially used to focus on expanding and maintaining telephone service, but in 2011 the FCC began transitioning to focus including broadband promotion through the Connect America Fund. So it took a while for that Connect America Fund to get up and running, but as of 2018, there was $1.5 billion spent through the Connect America Fund auction, phase 2 auction, and then there were various other alternative Connect America Fund spending and so on, and some legacy programs as well. The USDA programs are much smaller than in terms of total funding than the FCC programs. The traditional programs, which include those 4 listed on the right, in terms of program level, have generally been less than $800 million in program level. That's sort of the total amount of grants and loans per year. The budget authority is much less than that because the loans are mostly repaid back. So the budget authority for those programs is typically less than $70 million a year. These figures on the right don't include the 2 largest USDA programs. One is the Broadband Initiatives Program, which I mentioned was implemented in 2010. That was $2 billion in grants and $1 billion in loans. And then the new Reconnect program, which is $1.8 billion over the first 3 years in appropriations. This map shows where these program service areas have been. It shows that much of the country, much of rural America has had program service areas in their areas, but certainly not everywhere in the US has been covered by a program. And the 3 largest in terms of areas covered are the Broadband Initiatives Program, which is shown in blue, the Infrastructure Borrowers, which is the Telecommunications Infrastructure Loan Program in light green, and then the Connect America Fund, which is these orangish color.
John, 1 second. I believe that I am showing a different slide than you're on. Which slide are you on? I'm currently showing the USDA program slide, and I want to make sure we're linked up.
Okay, I wasn't sure whether you were showing my slides or your slides. Okay,
no, I'm showing your slides.
I'm to the map on slide 9.
Yep, I think we're on the same page. You should be able to see as well which one I'm on.
Okay, I'm just looking at my screen, so I don't know, but I'm going to the next slide, which is, I won't be able to have time to cover these next two slides, which basically are what do we know from published studies about the impacts of broadband programs. I found 5 studies that are published that looked at mostly, almost all of the studies looked at the USDA broadband loan program, and one of them also looked at the Community Connect grant program. And generally, they find some positive impacts on broadband availability and use, on employment, payroll, and number of businesses, on payroll per worker, and on farm sales and expenditures. But they find some differences across, like between the pilot level program for the broadband loan program and the regular broadband loan program, generally finding more impacts of the pilot program. And then also across different contexts, they found, some of the outcomes were better in more urban areas and some of the outcomes were better in more rural areas. So there's kind of a mix of impacts that have been found so far. So just to conclude, I would say, although there's been substantial progress in expanding broadband access and use, there's still a rural-urban digital divide. A large amount has been invested by the federal government in efforts to bridge that divide, but we don't know that much about the impacts of those efforts. And looking at the studies that I found, they focused on only a few programs, basically almost entirely on the USDA broadband loan program, and almost all of those focused on the period prior to 2010. The studies that I did find had some, interesting, positive impacts, but there were also some conflicting results, as I mentioned. So there needs to be more research on the impacts of other programs as well, some of these larger ones especially, and certainly more recent programs. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Our next presenter is Anna Reed. Anna Reed is the research officer at Pew's Broadband Research Initiative. Before Pew, she worked as a project manager on regional broadband planning efforts for Missouri's Office of Administration.
Hi, I'm Anna Reed. I'm the research officer with the Pew Charitable Trust Broadband Research Initiative. Pew is a nonpartisan nonprofit research organization, and we primarily focus on how to solve complex policy challenges, and one of those over the last several years has been broadband. The Broadband Research Initiative specifically has been focused on the role of states in expanding broadband access, and how states are addressing this challenge. So I'm going to just go through a quick overview of our research. Alex and John have identified some of the challenges related to broadband access and some of the benefits of increased broadband connectivity. So in terms of what states are doing to address this challenge, we started about 2 years ago, and we looked across all 50 states to get a better sense of state policy and state programs that are working to close gaps in broadband access. From there, we decided to focus on a set of case study states, which are on this map. So 9 states across the country that have programs in different phases with different resource levels, and slightly different challenges in what they're needing to solve for in order to close gaps in broadband access. We visited each of the states. Luckily, we were doing this research in 2019, and we did interviews with a number of stakeholders engaged in state broadband programs. So the state broadband program staff, other state agency staff, grantees, and other stakeholders who are engaged in these initiatives, such as local officials, broadband committee members, members of advocacy organizations that work on broadband in the state, to really get an understanding of what steps those state programs are taking, what's working, and what some of the challenges are. So this is just an overview of our state broadband policy explorer, which looks at, again, broadband policy across all 50 states, as well as some trends that we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of how states are addressing this. And then also we've done some short analysis on how this policy is shaping broadband deployment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that with our report, which we released in February 2020. It focuses on how states are expanding access, both on the policy and programmatic side. Since February, obviously, the urgency around this issue has become greater, and there has been an increased focus on the need to address those gaps in broadband access and to solve for them as quickly as possible to address the challenge. Before I get into really sort of the big piece of what states are doing, there are a couple things that we like to emphasize and that we kind of jokingly call the near universal truth of broadband. But across states, we really heard about the importance of leadership at the executive and legislative levels for making this issue a priority, for bringing state agencies to the table, and for just really providing leadership on making sure that steps are being taken to close the digital divide. The next piece is just kind of the idea that projects are the people, that you have really engaged stakeholders. You have, state broadband staff who are taking a leadership role in this. You have local broadband committee members who are really working hard to identify those local solutions to make sure communities do have access to broadband. And finally, just the role of state broadband programs as partners for stakeholders and resources, and the sort of neutral role that they play in this space in terms of being advocates for expanding broadband access, but not necessarily for any specific solution or group engaged in that process. So as we looked across states, we identified a set of what we're calling promising practices. And these are things that we see different states, again, with different resource levels and different phases of their programs, using to make progress on this, on closing gaps in broadband access. And states are generally trying to solve for the same challenge, which is bringing broadband to those areas that currently lack it, and improving access in unserved areas. So with that, we also just like to emphasize, it's a multifaceted challenge, which is reflected in these practices, is reflected in how states are addressing it. There's no single solution. And one way this was described to us several times in interviews is there's no silver bullet, there's just buckshot. And so, states are really looking at multiple ways to address this challenge. So the practices that we identified that we see across states are stakeholder outreach and engagement. States are doing this both at the state and local levels, engaging stakeholders at the state level, facilitating engagement at the local level, and including a broad range of stakeholders. So, as we've really seen over the last few months, broadband is important to a number of things. It's important to, the ability to participate in education, access healthcare, and other services. So, states are engaging health agencies, they're engaging education agencies, they're engaging their departments of transportation. And at the local level, they're also facilitating engagement with a range of stakeholders that can help shape solutions. States are establishing a policy framework that, addresses broadband as a priority. It addresses some of the questions around who can and cannot provide access. Alex touched on the role of electric cooperatives. And it creates a framework for stakeholders to respond to in addressing the challenge and finding solutions. The third practice is planning and capacity building, and this really provides the bridge between policy and implementation. States are working on state-level broadband plans that create goals that have objectives around both access and adoption, and implementation measures. They're also facilitating and funding planning activity and technical assistance activity at the local level, which is very important for educating stakeholders, for identifying local needs and finding local solutions that will work locally. The fourth practice is funding and operations. So states are providing funding for those state broadband programs, they're also providing funding for grants to help address that cost of infrastructure and make those projects feasible. And then they're evaluating their progress and then using that to inform next steps. And with that, we're seeing more states address the adoption and digital inclusion element after having started with infrastructure-focused programs. And then just one final note on sort of these practices is that as states are working to address that goal of increasing broadband access, there's also a value in the process of getting there, which can be time-consuming, but it brings stakeholders together. It helps identify those solutions that will meet local and community needs. So just to wrap up, over the last few months with the pandemic, it's really increased the urgency around this issue and really highlighted some of the applications that people need every day, the ability to work from home, participate in distance learning activities, and access healthcare and other services at home. With that, there's been a lot of emphasis on short-term solutions, such as hotspots and public Wi-Fi access that will bring people online quickly. This is an infrastructure challenge and one that takes time and resources to solve, and over the long term, there is a need for ongoing investment in these long-term solutions for broadband infrastructure and adoption. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Our next and final panelist is Mike Malandro. Mike Malandro is the president and CEO of Choptank Electric Cooperative, which is based in Denton, Maryland. Choptank is the second electric cooperative where Mike has successfully launched a broadband deployment effort, and he is also a certified engineer.
I'm Mike Malandro, CEO of Choptank Electric Cooperative. I like to call the broadband problem we have, it's a local problem with a local solution. Next slide. A little history on the co-op. We were formed in 1938 by 184 residents who banded together to bring electricity to their farms and homes. Essentially, we were having the same problem today with rural broadband that we had electricity previously in the rural areas. It's vital to our economic survival, and the larger companies just don't deem it profitable to come into our areas. Well, since that time, we've grown to over 54,000 customers and 6,300 miles of power line. We also have 650 miles of middle mile fiber that we use to serve our electric infrastructure for smart grid purposes. So we're able to be very efficient in how we operate our electric system with this fiber middle mile. So what we wanted to do was turn that into a retail broadband. We're governed by a board of directors who are also electric co-op members, and they're democratically elected by their fellow members. So this year, the membership asked us to look into the broadband and see if we can bring last mile broadband to the membership. And so we started that process. Next slide. So electric cooperatives across the country right now are either looking at broadband or they've already started it. I think the number is somewhere around 200 cooperatives that have embarked upon this. There's approximately about 900 electric cooperatives in the country. And they can't wait any longer to serve their communities. We're very community based. We're the anchors of these rural communities in a lot of places. So we're kind of taking this problem into our own hands. Once a few of us started doing it and could see that it was working, others started to follow suit. So broadband, I already talked about this, enhanced the electric grid operations, and the other offshoot of that is that we can now bring last mile retail access to our homes and businesses in the area. So across the country, a lot of the co-op CEOs are looking at this as history is repeating itself, so it's very equivalent to the 1930s. We're solving the rural electrification again, but with broadband. Next slide. So the first step was we needed to become what's called member regulated. So most, or 87% of the co-ops in this country are regulated by their membership. But in Maryland, we are regulated by the Public Utility Commission. And so they treat us just like they would an investor-owned utility like Exelon or Delmarva Power. And so in order to make this work and use our economies of scale, we needed to get some of the regulatory burdens out of our way. So legally, we could use our own equipment and our own infrastructure to serve our members and use their own equity to do what we wanted to do with it. So what this essentially does is it lets us use our own stuff. We can go ahead and compete in some of the federal grant funds and state and local funds. And what the funding does for the co-op, I believe the co-op can do it without subsidies, but the subsidies speeds up the build out. So when the co-op started electrifying America in the 1940s and 50s, it took 20 years to electrify rural America. So I don't think we can really wait 20 years for the broadband. So if we can get some subsidies, we can speed that up. There's some co-ops out there that are getting this done in 5 years. They've had good subsidies, and also they've laid a lot of their own equity out on the line to get it done. I'm thinking that Choptank is probably going to take more around 10 years, but hopefully we can get some subsidies and move that along much quicker. And we're democratically controlled. So all we're trying to do is get a return and just enough to pay our debt service and run the co-op. We're not trying to make a profit. We're a not-for-profit organization. So essentially what I like to say is that we chase revenues, not profits. So our members said, we can't wait decades. We're going to do this for ourselves. Next slide. So how are we going to do this? We're going to build a fiber to the home network. We may do a little bit of wireless here and there. Fixed wireless is what I call a bridge to fiber. It has about a 5 to 7 year lifespan. Speeds are throttled by the number of users, meaning that if you've only got two people on the local network, then it's not a problem. But as users start to increase, you start to have problems because it's throttled. You usually have data caps, and then they expire too soon. Latency is obviously an issue because it's a wireless signal. Now fiber, the biggest disadvantage of fiber, it's a large capital expenditure. But it lasts 50 years. It has limitless speeds, no data limits, no latencies. So in our opinion, it's the way to go for a long-term play, and the cooperative is in the long-term infrastructure business. So we plan to bring gigabit speed to the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Next slide, please. So what are some of our advantages? Well, first, we're an infrastructure business, and we've been in business for over 85 years. We have linemen, all the bucket trucks, all the equipment that do everything we need to do, plus all the back-end resources. So really, it's the same business we're in now, just a different flavor. When I was started first looking at this business in 2016, I asked myself the question, well, how can we get the electricity to all these rural homes and not the broadband? And then as I started answering more questions, I realized that it is possible. It's just going to take some effort and some time. We can leverage all of our existing assets, like the 650 miles of middle mile broadband, which eliminates a big piece for us. And we're also, like I said before, we're able to use that to more efficiently run our electric system, which brings down costs for the electric numbers. We're well capitalized and have access to long-term borrowing at very attractive rates. Also, we can seek some federal and state grant funds, and right-of-ways. That is a very important piece to this puzzle. We were able to pass a law in 2019 that allows us to use our right-of-ways for broadband use. In the past, we were only allowed to use that for electrical use. So that's another step in solving the rural broadband problem in our backyard. So essentially, at the end of the day, we're going to be able to use our economies of scale, and Choptank is a trusted community partner. And everybody knows if we put our foot forward on this, we're going to make it happen. So one of the biggest challenges for the cooperatives, we're not used to being in a competitive environment. So that's obviously a challenge for us. But we feel like a lot of the places that we're going to be going initially, well, we don't have any competition because there's nobody serving those areas. So it's kind of a no-brainer. And then as we move forward, we will start to serve, maybe compete with some other people. But the first objective is to serve the unserved, because that's what the community wants and that's the community needs. So that's where we will be at and come in and serve that. Next slide, please. So in short, the member regulation allows us to bring broadband services faster and more comprehensively than any other entity here on the Eastern Shore. Next slide, please. So our timeline for our success is we passed our legislation last spring, and we held a member vote. So all of our members had to vote on this, and we had a 97.7% voted yes out of the voting membership, which we had a little over a third of our membership vote, which is really impressive, because typically on just an election, we have less than 10% that actually cast votes. The fall, which is where we're at right now, we are spinning up this business, putting the financing together, getting all of bank accounts, insurance, things like that put together. And then in January, we're going to share our deployment map, which all the folks on the shore will be able to look and see, okay, this is the year I should expect service from the cooperative. So we're putting our long 10-year plan out. And then in the summer 2021, we expect to connect members to internet and phone service up to 1 gigabit in speed. We anticipate a 10-year infrastructure project, and we're hoping that we can get grant funding so we can, add resources to expedite the deployment. So that's pretty much what we're doing, and I feel pretty confident. I've done this at another utility and cooperative in Virginia, and they've been in this business since 2018. They're very successful, and the only problem they really have now is they just can't get it in fast enough for everybody that wants it. And that's a true challenge, because everybody wants it yesterday, but this is a large infrastructure problem, and it does take time to build it, and it takes a lot of cooperation from just about everybody to get it done. So that concludes my presentation.
A quick word of thanks to our partners. This and other Seafair programming wouldn't be possible without the continued support of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistical Service, as well as the Department's Economics Research Service. Thanks for watching. Come back on November 16th for our upcoming webinar, Economic Perspectives on Wildfire.